The housing bubble in Canada is imploding, and basically we have to go all the way back to 2008 when the CMHC started buying mortgages to understand exactly what happened here. You see, back in 2008 there was a global financial crisis. The Federal Reserve in the United States dropped interest rates massively during that time to new lows that nobody had ever seen, and the Bank of Canada followed straight after the Federal Reserve and did exactly the same thing. At the same time, you had a bank bailout called the IMPP that was rushed through, and you also had the CMHC that was buying mortgages en masse during that time. And these were the type of mortgages that were the bad ones. They were the subprime ones that were lent out in the period leading up to 2008. But when you actually look at the Canadian household position in terms of debt, it was actually much lower than the United States. When you look at the United States, household debt was much higher. The households in the United States were much more leveraged. So the fact is, in Canada, what happened was when interest rates went down during that period of time, you then saw the housing market boom, literally a couple of years after that. By 2010 and 2011, you already saw housing prices that began to overtake the previous highs. Some areas like Alberta were particularly hard hit by the global financial crisis and the recession, since it relied a lot on oil and gas and mining, and financing during that period was very hard to get, so that meant that the economy was really suffering back then. What you saw happen since then, during the Conservative government, remember, because the Conservatives were in power from 2006. This was Stephen Harper's government. Pierre was actually a part of that government during that time. And the interesting thing is, you saw housing prices that just continued to rise during that period of time, which eventually led to the election of Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau was a leftist populist candidate, and Justin Trudeau managed to win a majority during that election. Some of the key issues that were campaigned on during that time were exactly the same issues as you see the main status quo parties campaigning on right now. Such things as a high cost of living, housing affordability. They were all bad back then, and they're still bad now. In fact, they're a lot worse now thanks to Justin Trudeau. You could say that he definitely helped amplify the situation that already the Conservatives had created through prior bailouts. And then Justin Trudeau in 2020, under his government, they actually did another bailout and were buying mortgages through the Bank of Canada and through the CMHC to stimulate lending into the Canadian housing bubble. Now, the problem is most average people in Canada had no idea of the dynamic that was going on. What was going on was very similar to the bailout that was done in 2008. However, unlike back in 2008, this was accompanied with an unprecedented amount of government stimulus that was injected into the economy. And the housing market could not have got more distorted during that time. Many of you will remember that there were lots of people that were taking mortgage deferrals. In fact, the numbers were quite staggering, the amount of people that were taking mortgage deferrals. And during that time, people weren't really doing a lot during 2020 and 2021. So that meant that they were able to save up a lot of money. And they did save up a lot of money. And where did that money go? It went straight back into the real estate market and straight back into the bubble. The housing market in Canada after 2020 was one of the most distorted housing markets in the world. To the average person, it just looked like an incredibly strong housing market that would never collapse. This housing bubble could never fail. People used to call me an absolute lunatic for saying that the Canadian housing bubble will crash, and it is a certainty, and it's just a case of when it's going to happen. The mania that ensued in 2021 and 2022 was really a sign that we were in the final stages of this bubble. Generally, when you see a blow off top, when you see people go completely insane over a certain market, that means you are at the top of that market. And I remember hearing so many people during that time who said real estate will never go down in price. This is it. If you don't get in now, you're never going to get in. The fact is, nobody could afford to get into the market back then. But the way the banks work in Canada is they prioritize the people who have assets against those who don't. I mean, at the end of the day, that sounds kind kind of logical because the banks have the assets of that person and then say, okay, well, if you default on the loan, we're going to take your assets. But that only works to a certain point. It only works if values are ever increasing. And of course, the Canadian banks were quite vocal that housing prices were just going to go up and up and up and up. Now, I'm willing to bet that high-level executives at the banks knew that the housing market was going to crash at some point, and they just continued on with this because, as they know from the past, such as with the Conservatives and with the Liberals, they are guaranteed pretty much to get a bailout because the government, after all, is insuring a lot of these mortgages. So what this created was insane moral hazard, which went into the lending industry, which meant that there was massive, rampant amounts of mortgage fraud, people changing documents. I've heard from people in the lending space who worked in compliance within the banking system who've told me that they were targeted with certain amounts of mortgages that they would have to and need to get approved. I've heard from people who said that they've had colleagues fired for questioning and putting red flags on different mortgages that have come through. So the fact is, this went right up to the top in the banking system and people knew what was going on. They just didn't care because the amount of money that was going into the real estate industry and the banking industry was absolutely massive. But it was all at the cost of the average person. And who is going to bear the brunt of the responsibility of what's going to happen now this bubble is imploding and values are reversing and the Canadian banks have hundreds of billions of dollars of mortgages that are effectively in default on their books? They're in shadow default. You see, because nobody could afford a home during that period of time, during the mania, people opted towards these fixed payment variable rate loans. And they sound as stupid as the name. Basically, these loans had a fixed payment, but the rate, the interest rate on the loan was variable, meaning that if your interest rate went up, that would essentially mean the amount of your payment that was allocated towards interest would go up. And not only that, that sometimes meant that the payment would actually exceed the amount of interest that you need to pay, and that would go into a negatively amortizing mortgage. These are similar products to the products that were around during the global financial crisis. And the amount of fraud that was going on has been completely understated. I mean, I have spoke to so many people within the industry that have just said, Luke, you would be absolutely shocked at the numbers when it comes to mortgage fraud. It is unbelievable. And it's quite obvious that people would have needed to commit fraud in order to get into the housing market. Because you look at markets like Toronto, Vancouver, Mississauga, Ottawa, many other places, and the average income, the medium income, it doesn't make any sense. Nobody could afford to go out and buy a home. So people started to fiddle their income and they thought, well, it doesn't really matter because housing prices only go up and I'm probably going to just sell this in a couple of years for a profit. Those people tried to blame the Bank of Canada for their poor decisions, saying that the Bank of Canada promised that they would have interest rates low for a very long time, a very vague statement that they made. But they forget that the Bank of Canada also said that they were extremely worried about what was going on in the housing market and also said that housing prices don't just go up. But people conveniently ignored the Bank of Canada saying that. And now the Canadian housing bubble accounts for 40% of the economy. In fact, it's much higher than that. If you look at this Remax report, you can say that then they were saying that housing as part of the economy was nearly 40% of GDP. But right now, it could be way higher than that. And that means that when the housing bubble implodes, as it is right now, that affects the economy massively. So why can't we see it in the economy? Well, the economy is flatlining right now. It's not really growing that much. But part of the reason of why it's still flatlining and growing and not crashing is simply because of the mass migration program. You see, you have to think of mass migration as putting up a veil in front of the economy so that people can't actually see what's going on behind the scenes. They can't see all the skeletons that are hidden back there. So basically, by instigating this mass migration program that has boomed, it has also sent Canada into a cost of living crisis. And it has also sent Canada into a terrible per capita depression that has not been seen by any other country country in the G7 or G20. The per capita GDP in Canada has been absolutely crashing, and many different international organizations and media have picked up on how bad this is and are predicting that it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. You see, people ask what the solution is here, and unfortunately, with so much damage done, there is no good solution. The only solution is that you try and educate people and get them up to speed on how the government influenced this housing bubble, how the government effectively crashed the economy behind the scenes and made it more reliant on real estate. And then ask yourself, do any of the political parties, the status quo political parties like the Conservatives, the Liberals and the NDP, are they going to do anything drastically different to change this? And look at history. See, have they done it in the past? Why are they going to do it now? And you will find out that unfortunately, it doesn't look like it's going to happen. You see, the reason why I have a passion for producing these videos is because it's educating people on how the system works. And once people understand how rigged the system is, how CMHC is not an institution that is helping you buy a home, it is helping banks get bailed out, then you understand that we don't need that institution and we would be better off without it. Once you understand how mass migration puts a veil in front of the economy, it becomes very easy to then understand how it's actually ruining the economy. And this isn't a dig at immigrants. After all, I'm an immigrant myself, so that would make me a hypocrite. Immigrants are doing a lot of the jobs that Canadians won't do themselves. They're filling all those jobs and they're literally living in poverty. So I would say have a massive heart for the immigrants that are here today, because those people are suffering tremendously. In fact, they are the modern day slaves of Canada. And the thing is, I want an end to that slavery. We're doing a disservice to them, and I think it's absolutely terrible. And not only that, the reason why they are doing those jobs and Canadians aren't doing those jobs is because by bringing in more and more workers, you suppress the wages, especially for low-skilled, low-wage jobs. And who does this benefit? This benefits massive corporations that have the cash and have the money to pay the higher wages, but just choose not to invest in their workers. And it's no wonder why you see productivity that is absolutely tanking. This is Canada and it needs to change. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, I'd highly recommend that you watch this interview that I did on the podcast channel. And if you are looking for a VPN to protect your privacy, go to expressvpn.com/marketmania. I will see you in the next one. Take care.